The month was February 19, barely 2 months after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and at a time when the Pacific War had solidified into a grinding series of ambushes and attritional struggles in the archipelagos of Southeast Asia. The United States Marine Corps, thinly spread across forward posts in the Philippines and Borneo, found itself trying to hold ground it had neither expected to defend nor been fully prepared to sustain against the calibrated tidal wave of the Japanese offensive. On the tiny island of Bataan Island, a slender ribbon of land north of Luzon, a detachment of U.S. Marines had been deployed to maintain a forward base that could support American air operations and radar installations. The post was not a fortress, it was a strategic sentinel, established to delay Japanese advances by offering early warning, and to serve as a communication relay for forces further south. In the early weeks of February, Japanese air and sea power over the Pacific had gained near complete dominance, and isolated outposts like the one on Bataan were increasingly vulnerable to encirclement and assault. It was in this context that Second Lieutenant Robert Bob Caldwell, a young Marine officer recently transferred from stateside duty, assumed command of a provisional platoon of 18 Marines tasked with maintaining the Bataan perimeter. Caldwell was not a man of fame in the Corps, nor was he an extraordinary strategist by his own account. Yet in the course of his first month on Bataan Island, he would confront a crucible of command that would test every tenet of Marine training and every principle of leadership he had ever learned. On the 14th of February 1942, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, long silhouetted against the western horizon, appeared once more over Bataan, this time in formation. Smaller floatplanes, their wings stretched against the morning sun, dipped low over the shallow reefs and muddy strip that passed for the Marine landing field. The Marines, already warned by intelligence intercepts of increasing Japanese interest in Philippine airfields, immediately sounded their alarm. Radios crackled with reports, and Lieutenant Caldwell ordered his men to battle stations. But despite the heightened alert, and in spite of repeated aerial overflights, no ground assault materialized that day. Instead, the reconnaissance flights appeared merely to be comprehensive surveys, mapping terrain, assessing defensive positions, gauging troop dispositions. To the Marines on the ground, these flights felt like the slow grind of inevitability. The island was being cataloged for a strike that would not take long to come. The next day, 15th of February, the Japanese returned with far greater force. A flotilla of transports and destroyers, screened by patrol craft, made its way into the shallow reaches off the eastern shore of Bataan. By mid-morning, Japanese infantry had disembarked and moved inland with mechanical precision. Marine outposts reported contact with advancing enemy patrols. The terrain was unforgiving, thick brush, narrow trails that meandered through mangrove-lined bogs and small ridges that offered minimal cover. The Marines, trained to repel amphibious assaults but never in sufficient numbers on Bataan to build a layered defense, established a loose perimeter and prepared to delay the assault as long as possible. Lieutenant Caldwell, aware that he had nowhere near enough men to hold a full defensive line, made the tactical decision to consolidate his platoon around the perimeter of the improvised airstrip and to hold at all costs, recognizing that any retreat would only hasten the island's fall and expose the garrison to envelopment. By the afternoon of 15th February, contact with the Japanese had intensified. Reports from forward listening posts indicated that small units of infantry were probing the Marine perimeter. Caldwell, known among his platoon for his attention to detail, had ensured that his men were ordered to fire only on confirmed enemy sightings. He knew that false alarms could waste precious ammunition and quickly degrade his unit's combat effectiveness. In the humid heat, with the shriek of aircraft seldom far overhead, the Marines waited in nervous silence. At roughly 30 hours, Japanese troops numbering roughly 18 appeared on a slight ridge some 150 meters from the Marine position. These soldiers were not yet advancing in a coordinated assault. Instead, they seemed to be reconnoitering the perimeter, their rifles carried at ease as they surveyed the scattered positions of the U.S. Marines. Commanders on both sides often understood that the opening engagements of this campaign would not be uniform set peace battles, but rather a series of probing maneuvers designed to test strength and resolve. Caldwell, observing through binoculars the small party on the ridge, recognized immediately that they were not merely scouts. Their posture, the way they held their rifles, and the lack of any support elements suggested that this was a detached execution detail, a unit ordered not to probe defenses, but to eliminate them quickly and brutally. Intelligence reports the Marines had intercepted weeks earlier described a similar Japanese practice in other parts of the Philippines, where small detachments were instructed to take out isolated Marine or Army posts to prevent organized resistance. The method was swift surround, demand surrender, and if the garrison refused or hesitated, carry out an execution to set an example. To the Marines on Bataan, far from any large force, this was a terrifying prospect. Rather than give the Japanese a clear target, Caldwell ordered his men to maintain strict fire discipline. He directed the platoon to hold their positions and wait. The Japanese party crept closer, stopping once they were within 75 meters of the Marine lines. For 10 minutes neither side fired. The tension was absolute. The humid air seemed to thicken around the men on both sides. Caldwell could hear the low murmur of voices through the radio static, but the content was unintelligible. He later reported that psychoacoustically the silence was more deafening than any battle noise he had previously experienced. Then, without warning, the Japanese group raised their rifles and fired a series of rapid shots toward the Marine positions. The initial burst of automatic fire struck the air and earth around the Marines with a ferocity that belied the small size of the attacking party. Shards of wood and splinters of earth sprayed the defensive perimeter. Marines fell where they stood, others dropped instinctively and returned fire in brief, controlled bursts. The engagement was chaotic but measured. Caldwell, shouting orders over the roar, tried to keep his men aligned and focused on the attackers. But within moments, it became clear that the Japanese attack was not aimed at breaking the line through force of numbers. Instead, what had occurred was a deliberate attempt to initiate the encounter, likely to force a perception of overwhelming firepower and encourage a quick collapse of the Marine resistance. Caldwell saw through this immediately. He understood that this was not a tactical assault, but a psychological gambit. Strike first, intimidate your opponent, and seize control of the battlefield without protracted combat. Caldwell nonetheless ordered a return of fire. The Marines, trained to make every shot count, aimed at visible enemy combatants. The Japanese party, taken by surprise at the accuracy of the Marine rifles, momentarily faltered. 3 of the 18 attackers were struck and fell, but the Japanese fighters did not retreat. Instead, they reformed behind a small rise only 30 meters ahead and continued to fire sporadically, pinning down the closest Marine positions. Lieutenant Caldwell knew his men were outnumbered and outgunned at close range. If the Japanese succeeded in overrunning the perimeter, the Marines would be slaughtered or captured. He also knew that to withdraw into the interior of the island offered no strategic advantage. There was no prepared fallback position, no secondary line of defense, and no water position from which to mount an effective counter. Withdrawal would quickly dissolve into rout. The only viable option was to hold and to find a way to force the Japanese detachment to either retreat or to surrender. It was at this moment, with bullets ricocheting off soil and wood, and the cries of wounded Marines piercing the air, that Caldwell made a decision that would later be scrutinized by historians, military analysts, and surviving veterans alike. With ammunition running low and casualties mounting, he ordered his men to cease fire and to load blank rounds into their rifles. Then, with his own pistol drawn, he stepped forward from behind the scant cover of an ammunition crate and called out in broken Japanese, using phrases he had learned from intelligence briefings. Caldwell's voice was firm and clear. "We surrender nothing. Leave now." The shouted command carried over the gunfire and the humidity of the afternoon atmosphere. For a brief, surreal moment, both sides were silent. The 18 Japanese soldiers, recognizing the Marines had ceased firing and noticing Caldwell alone and unprotected at the center of the line, halted their advance. A tense standoff ensued. Caldwell, fully aware that he had gambled everything on this maneuver, continued to speak, not to threaten, but to communicate that further bloodshed would serve no purpose. Some accounts from later interviews with surviving Marines indicate that the Japanese detachment's commanding non-commissioned officer lowered his rifle slightly and issued orders in rapid Japanese to his men. The Marines, watching every shift in posture and every twitch of the fingers near trigger guards, held their breath. The confrontation persisted for long minutes that felt like hours. Finally, the Japanese detachment withdrew back toward the ridge they had occupied earlier that day. They did not retreat in disorder, nor did they carry out the executions that military intelligence had feared. Instead, they withdrew with a studied precision, turning occasionally to fire suppressive shots as they stepped back into the brush. Caldwell ordered his men not to pursue, recognizing that any chase would expose his platoon to a larger force likely advancing behind the initial execution party. By dusk on the 15th of February 1942, the immediate threat had passed. The Japanese assault unit had disappeared into the undergrowth, and Caldwell's platoon, reduced in number and shaken by the encounter, regrouped within the perimeter. The island was not secure, far from it, but the Marines had survived an engagement that, by all conventional expectations, should have ended in their capture or execution. What had occurred on the ridge that afternoon would later become a subject of intense analysis within Marine Corps tactical circles. Lieutenant Caldwell's decision to confront 18 enemy soldiers alone, ordering his men to fire blanks while he stood in exposed terrain, was not standard doctrine. Yet the calculated risk, born of a deep understanding of Japanese infantry tactics and a cold appraisal of his own unit's limitations, had forced a disengagement under terms more favorable than annihilation. This early encounter on Bataan Island encapsulated the brutal pragmatism of warfare in the Pacific, where small units often faced overwhelming odds, where individual decisions bore consequences far beyond their immediate sphere, and where the will to confront a dire situation could mean the difference between life and death. Night fell quickly over Bataan Island on the 15th of February 1942, not with the relief that darkness sometimes brought to embattled troops, but with a deeper uncertainty. The Marines knew that the withdrawal of the Japanese detachment did not signify a reversal of intent, only a temporary pause. Lieutenant Caldwell ordered his remaining men to redistribute ammunition, tend to the wounded as best they could, and reinforce the shallow fighting positions carved into the soil around the airstrip. The island was quiet, but it was not calm. From the eastern shore came the distant sounds of engines and metallic clatter, suggesting continued Japanese movement and consolidation. Caldwell understood that the encounter earlier that day would not go unreported. The Japanese army did not tolerate failed missions lightly, particularly in the opening phase of an offensive where speed, intimidation, and momentum were critical. An execution detail that returned without accomplishing its task would draw scrutiny from higher command, and scrutiny would bring consequences. Shortly after midnight, Marine radio operators intercepted fragmented Japanese transmissions. Though incomplete, the content was unmistakable. The detachment that had withdrawn from the ridge had reported unexpected resistance and casualties inflicted by a larger-than-anticipated Marine force. This mischaracterization was significant. Caldwell immediately grasped its importance. The Japanese soldiers, unwilling to admit that 18 men had been held off by a depleted platoon, had overstated Marine strength to justify their withdrawal. This distortion, born out of self-preservation within the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Army, would shape Japanese decisions in the hours to come. It introduced hesitation into an operation that relied on relentless pressure and speed. At dawn on the 16th of February, Japanese artillery fire began to fall on the island, though not with the intensity Caldwell had feared. Shells landed sporadically, more probing than destructive. Caldwell suspected that Japanese commanders were attempting to confirm Marine strength before committing larger infantry elements. The airstrip, which had been the focal point of the Marines' defensive posture, was cratered in several places, but the bombardment lacked the sustained concentration, typically used to soften a position prior to assault. This restraint was telling. It suggested that Japanese command was uncertain whether Bataan was held by a reinforced Marine detachment rather than the isolated platoon that actually remained. Throughout the morning, Japanese patrols approached the Marine perimeter but did not close in. Caldwell ordered his men to remain concealed and silent unless fired upon. The Marines, exhausted and running on minimal sleep, complied. Their discipline held. The silence, combined with the lingering impression left by the previous day's confrontation, reinforced the illusion of a stronger American presence. Japanese observers, peering through binoculars from the tree line and higher ground, reported limited movement but could not determine the size of the defending force. The decision not to fire was as critical as the decision to fire had been the day before. Caldwell understood that revealing his unit's true strength would invite immediate destruction. By midday, Japanese command made a decision that effectively sealed the fate of the island, though not in the way initially intended. Rather than launch an immediate infantry assault, they chose to bypass Bataan as a priority objective and redirect resources toward larger, more strategically valuable positions on Luzon. The island would be neutralized later after the collapse of organized resistance elsewhere. This choice was not an act of mercy, nor was it a concession of defeat. It was a calculated allocation of force. But for the Marines on Bataan, it meant time. Time to evacuate, time to destroy sensitive equipment, and time to deny the Japanese an easy propaganda victory. Caldwell received confirmation of this shift in priority late on the 16th February through a brief but critical radio transmission from higher headquarters. The message, heavily encoded and transmitted under conditions of extreme interference, instructed the Marine detachment to prepare for evacuation if possible, or failing that, to destroy all operational assets and withdraw inland to evade capture. Caldwell immediately convened his non-commissioned officers. The decision was grim but clear. The airstrip was no longer defensible, and its continued occupation offered no strategic benefit. The priority now was survival and denial. Over the next 24 hours, the Marines worked methodically. Fuel dumps were ignited. Radio equipment was dismantled or smashed, and any remaining supplies that could not be carried were rendered unusable. Wounded Marines who could not move without assistance were evacuated first, supported by their comrades despite the risk of exposure. Caldwell oversaw every step, ensuring that nothing of intelligence value would fall into Japanese hands. The destruction was not reckless, it was systematic, guided by training manuals that few Marines ever expected to apply under such conditions. Each act of sabotage was an admission that the island was lost, but it was also an assertion that defeat would not come cheaply. During the early hours of 18th of February, as the Marines prepared to move inland under cover of darkness, Japanese patrols again appeared near the perimeter. This time they advanced cautiously, probing but not committing. Caldwell ordered his men to hold fire unless absolutely necessary. The Japanese, perhaps wary after their earlier encounter, maintained distance. The two forces shadowed one another through the night, aware of each other's presence but unwilling to trigger another engagement whose outcome was uncertain. By dawn, the Marines had slipped away from the airstrip and into the island's interior, leaving behind only scorched earth and silence. The episode involving the 18 Japanese soldiers did not immediately enter official records as a discrete incident. In the chaos of early 1942, with Allied forces retreating across the Pacific, small unit actions on remote islands were often overshadowed by larger battles and strategic collapses. However, within the Marine Corps, Caldwell's actions became known through after-action reports and personal accounts from surviving members of his platoon. These reports emphasized not heroism in the conventional sense, but judgment under pressure. Caldwell had not charged the enemy, nor had he relied on superior firepower. He had exploited the psychological and doctrinal constraints of his opponent, understanding that Japanese junior leaders operated within a system that punished failure harshly and rewarded aggression only when it succeeded. The Japanese Army's approach to executions and intimidation during the early Pacific campaigns was rooted in both doctrine and experience from earlier conflicts in China. Execution of captured enemy soldiers was intended not merely as punishment but as a deterrent, a means of breaking resistance through fear. However, this tactic depended on certainty of control. When faced with unexpected resistance or ambiguity, Japanese commanders often paused, reassessed, and escalated through different channels. Caldwell's intervention disrupted the script. By confronting the execution detail directly and presenting an image of resolve and strength, he introduced doubt where none was expected. That doubt was enough to halt the immediate action. In later interviews conducted after the war, Japanese officers acknowledged that small unit engagements like the one on Bataan Island sometimes led to overestimation of Allied strength, particularly in the opening months of the conflict, when intelligence was incomplete and assumptions about American fighting spirit were still forming. The failure of an execution detail to carry out its task would have been viewed not simply as a tactical setback, but as a potential indicator of flawed intelligence. The safer course, from the Japanese perspective, was to delay and reassess rather than risk unnecessary casualties or embarrassment. For Caldwell and his men, the psychological impact of the encounter was profound. The realization that they had stood on the brink of execution and survived not through overwhelming force, but through discipline and calculated risk altered their perception of the war. It stripped away any remaining illusions about chivalry or convention. The Pacific conflict, as they now understood it, was governed by stark choices and unforgiving consequences. Survival depended not only on bravery, but on understanding the enemy's mindset and exploiting its weaknesses. In the weeks that followed, Caldwell's platoon was eventually evacuated from the Philippines after a grueling journey that involved evasion disease and intermittent contact with Japanese patrols. Not all of the original detachment survived. Some succumbed to wounds sustained earlier. Others were lost during subsequent movements. Caldwell himself was wounded during a later engagement and spent months recovering before returning to active duty. He never described the events on Bataan Island as extraordinary. In his official report, he characterized his decision to confront the Japanese execution detail as necessary under the circumstances, a phrase that reflected both understatement and professional detachment. From a historical perspective, the incident offers a microcosm of the early Pacific War. It illustrates how small decisions, made under extreme pressure by junior officers far from headquarters, could shape outcomes disproportionate to the scale of the engagement. It also underscores the limitations of rigid doctrine when confronted with adaptive resistance. The Japanese Army's emphasis on speed, intimidation, and unquestioned execution of orders proved effective in many contexts, but it was not infallible. When confronted by an opponent willing to challenge assumptions and exploit hesitation, even a numerically superior force could be checked. The execution that never happened on Bataan Island did not alter the strategic trajectory of the war. The Philippines would fall, and the Pacific would remain contested for years. Yet for the men involved, it marked a definitive moment. It demonstrated that the line between life and death in wartime could hinge on seconds of judgment and the willingness to act decisively in defiance of expectation. Caldwell's decision did not stem from recklessness or bravado. It arose from a clear-eyed assessment of his situation and an understanding that passivity would guarantee destruction. In the years after the war, as official histories were written and the Pacific campaigns were analyzed in exhaustive detail, Incidents like the one on Baton Island received only passing mention, if any. They lacked the scale and drama of major battles. But within those overlooked moments lies a deeper truth about the nature of war. It is not only generals and admirals who shape outcomes, but also lieutenants on remote islands, faced with impossible choices and no margin for error. When 18 Japanese soldiers attempted to execute one Marine detachment, the outcome was not decided by numbers or firepower alone. It was decided by a single officer's refusal to accept the inevitability of defeat and his ability to impose uncertainty on an enemy accustomed to certainty. That refusal, quiet and uncelebrated, ensured that the execution never took place.